Hey, it's Tim. This is Quantum Komposer, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to chords. Chords is a chord progression creation tool and a special kind of arpeggiator. It works differently to most ARP tools, but in doing so brings some significant advantages which we'll explore in this video and the next one. It's the first app I built in the Quantum Komposer suite, and it's the foundation for the composition methodology I wanted to embody in Quantum Komposer. Chords is simply the melody and harmony CPU. There's essentially two parts to chords. There's the chord progression creation side, and then there's the note generation or the note output side, i.e. the ARP side. This video will focus more on part 1, chord progression generation or creation, and another video called Making Harmony with Quantum Komposer will focus on part 2, the note generation side. First, let's start with an overview of the architecture of chords so we understand how these two parts fit together. Chords has 8 scenes, like all the Quantum Komposer devices, and each scene has 8 chord slots. This is where we build up our chord progressions for each scene. Each chord slot in each scene has a duration, so once built, our song plays through the scenes and chord sets the current chord based on our progression. There's many ways in which you can use chords to build up progressions. The select, construct and record modes are just 3 ways. There's also a chord suggester and some chord presets. Once you have a progression, you want to use those chords to trigger your instruments. Here's where things get a little bit different. Chords has 8 channels in which you can receive MIDI notes, channels 5 to 12. These MIDI notes trigger the current chord or specific notes of the current chord, which are then passed on to our instruments. It's kind of like an arpeggiator, but in a way, an arpeggiator in reverse. Let me explain. Typical arpeggiator devices work in the following fashion. ARPs receive chords played or sent into the ARP device. The ARP device has a rate control and a series of built-in patterns to convert notes of the chord to a stream of single notes in a particular order at a particular rate. For example, chord notes can be output in ascending order or descending order or ascending then descending order. With the Quantum Komposer KORDS device, we reverse this flow. We send a stream of sequenced single notes into chords on a particular MIDI channel, and then chords outputs notes of the current chord or the whole chord based on the pitch of the incoming note and using the pattern or the rhythm of the incoming note sequence. So the rate and the pattern information comes from the note sequence here, and based on these notes, chords interprets which note of the chord or notes of the chord it sends out to our instruments. The main advantage of this method is that we're no longer limited to a set of built-in arpeggiator patterns. We can use any pattern we can sequence. So we now have unlimited arpeggiator patterns to work with. The key to this system is that chords transposes incoming notes to the notes of the current chord in the following way. It uses a root chord shape in which we define in the incoming scale setting. By default, it's set to C major, and you can leave this set to C major. There's no real need to change this ever. With this setting, our incoming notes use the root chord shape of C major to instruct chords which note of the current chord we wish to trigger. That means with the setting on C major, an incoming C note will always trigger the root note of the current chord, an incoming E note will always trigger the third or the second note of the current chord, and G will trigger the fifth or the third highest note of the current chord, and B will trigger the seventh or fourth note of the current chord. Let's have a look at a quick example. Here I have a sequence and it's triggering 3 notes, C, E and G, and it's being sent into chords. If we press play, we hear the notes C, E, G. If we switch to a different chord, the notes C and G now trigger the notes F, A and C. So with this single chord shape, C, E, G, B, we sequence notes which determine the rhythm and the notes that get output. Chords also responds to the octave of the incoming note. So in sending notes to chords, we influence 3 things: the notes of the current chord we wish to play, the octave of that chord note, and the timing of the chord note. Chords takes care of the chord and which notes are in that chord. We're not limited to particular arpeggiator patterns. So if we were to change the pattern here and add in some tied notes, and change the chord, we can create any pattern or sequence we want. Chords also has modes that allow you to trigger notes in other ways. Maybe you want to trigger all chord notes to play, or maybe you want a non-chord passing note to play between chord notes. The mode settings allow you to do this on a per channel, per scene basis. For example, C sharp would trigger a note 1 semitone above the current chord root note. However, if you prefer, you can set these modes to round non-C, E, G, B notes to chord notes, or even just ignore them, which is useful if you are using a random note generator. So by routing melodic sequences like this via chords, we don't have to be restricted to a key or scale, and we don't need to know any music theory to keep things sounding good. Everything works based on the current chord, and the current chord doesn't have to belong to a particular key or scale either. This means we can work with non-diatonic chords easily. So apart from telling chords which chord shape we'll use to communicate with chords, and typically we just leave this in C major always, we don't even need to set a scale or key for our song. We just compose our note sequences as if there was only one chord, C, E, G, B, and our melodic lines get converted to the current chord by the chords device. Now we have an overview of how chords works. Let's focus on how to generate chord progressions. Okay, so let's create a chord progression, and we can do our chord progressions or build the chord progressions in the 8 scenes that chords has, and each scene has 8 chord slots. And each chord slot has a set of common parameters, including duration, and we can select the duration, anything from 1 beat up to 32 bars. And we have also the inversion setting, the root note, the bass note, and the notes of the chords in pitch order. So this note chord here, C, E, G, B, C major 7th chord, we can invert, and if we turn the inversion dial to clockwise to first inversion, we now have the notes E, G, B and C, C being now the highest note. So we'll invert once more. And we can also invert down, which takes the top note and takes it down an octave. Here's where we adjust the bass note for our chord. So there is a number of ways which we can add chords to build up our chord progressions, and I thought we could just build up a common chord progression in a variety of different ways to see how you can do that. So first, let's just delete this chord. We'll go to settings, hit the delete mode button, and then tap on the chord we used to delete, and now that chord's gone. If we come across to a website I found, 7 common chord progressions, we can see the first one on the list is a nice simple one. In Roman numeral notation, it's a 1-5-6-4 chord progression in C major, and it has the chords C major, G major, A minor and F major. So let's have a go at building that in chords. Come back here. First we'll hit shift to go to settings, hit chords select mode, and now we just come into the chords dials here to select a root note. So we simply select C, we select a chord type from the list, so it has all your major common chord types here, so we want major, and we can set an inversion setting and a bass note. So that's our first chord. Let's take a new slot, and to get our second chord, G major, we'll go to the construct mode. And in this mode we create chords using intervals. So first we need to set a root note, and our chord root note is G. Then the second knob here is the third interval, or the interval between the root note and the second note of the chord. So we turn this dial and the intervals increase from left to right, so sus2, minor third, major third, sus4, so we'll set it to a major third, and our next interval is the interval between the root and the third note of the chord, or the fifth, and we can set that to a perfect fifth. So we've now got our G major chord. The third chord in the progression is A minor, so we'll come now to the record mode, and we hit the chord slot. It says waiting, and so I'm going to open the piano keyboard, and we want to play an A minor, so I'll just hit the keys and play the chord notes in, and now we have our A minor chord. So that's how you can record chord notes in. And the fourth chord of the progression is F major, so we'll select another chord slot. This time let's come back to the record mode, but instead of playing it in, we'll send the chord in from another chord progression device. So I'll just get rid of this for a second. I've got suggester here, and if I were to build up my progression in this app, I could come here and I want an F major chord. I'd add that to my song, and I can now click on here to set the record mode into waiting, click on my chord in Suggester, and my chord is there. So that's how you can send your chords in to Chords from other apps. A couple of suggestions are that we're only really interested in the essential quality of the chord, so the 3 or 4 notes of the chord if it's a triad or a tetrad. We add the bass note and we add other embellishments later when we're constructing our harmony and melody. So one recommendation would be in Suggester audio unit options. I would recommend turning off double the root of triads and playing bass. Now, we've just got some simple triads. Let's come back to the chord progression website, and down here there's the third progression on the list is a 2-5-1 progression in C major, and this progression is a jazz related progression, and it has some 7th chords in it. So let's come back and create these chords in Chords. We want a D minor 7th, a G dominant 7th, and a C major 7th. I'm just going to put them in the same scene here. Let's create another scene. So we want our first chord to be a D minor 7th. So I'll collect the select mode, select my root to D, and we just select minor 7th. Our second chord is G dominant 7th, and if we were to do that here, we would select a G and dominant 7th. So we'll go into construct mode, we'll select our G, and you can see that it's made up of a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a minor 7th. So if we just remove those and start again, we would select a G, and then a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and we would get the minor 7th to create the G dominant 7th chord. We could try a major 7th chord, but we'll leave it on the dominant 7th to create the minor 7th to create the G dominant 7th chord. And then in the record mode, the last chord in this progression is a C major 7th. So again, if we come to select mode, we could just choose C major 7th, and I could easily just record that in the same way that I did before, using the record mode and using the keyboard. And simple as that, it's done. So there's some different ways that you can build up your chord progressions, and we did an example using triads and tetrads. So now I'd like to come into one other way, and I'll set a duration here, select a chord slot. We can use the Suggester. Now the Suggester works by recommending or suggesting a chord based on the previous one. So it works best if you have a chord slot in the first chord slot of the scene. So let's come back to select mode and just select C major. Select a new chord slot and come back to scenes, and we can use the Suggester to suggest some chords. Okay, so let's choose another chord slot and use the suggester again. And one more for good measure. And now we could use the inversion setting to bring the root notes of the chords a bit closer together. Okay, so now we've built up a chord progression just using the suggester. It's also possible to transpose your chord progressions using the transpose knob. So let's transpose down a semitone, and the notes of the chords are updated. So if we go down, say, 5 semitones from our C, we're now in G. Or we could go up 5 semitones to F. It's also possible to transpose, to change the transpose mode from semitones to a circle of fifths. So we can use the transpose knob, and you can see it's set to the C major A minor setting in the circle of fifths, and from here we're transposing up a fifth. So here we're going to G, from C to G, and that's 7 semitones. So, but rather than just keep going up octaves, I'm using a minus 5 semitones to keep things in the 1 octave. So now we're using the circle of fifths to go from a C major chord progression to a G major, or we could go down to F. So you can transpose a scene, and this might be nice if you want to have your progression in one scene, like so. Then we can copy paste the scene, and then we can transpose to G, and in this scene now we have our next scene in G. Lastly, there is a selection of presets, and if we use the preset knob after selecting a scene, we can bring up a progression. And the presets have all the major modes. So here, preset number 3 is the Ionian, or the major mode, and it starts on the root note of C. So this is C major, and you can see the chords built on the scale degrees. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. And I could also transpose these chord sets to get to a different major scale set. So now I have the F F major chord set. I can get the G major, and if we have a look, we've also got the other modes: D Dorian, E Phrygian, F Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian, and there's some other chord sets in there as well, like noodling the tonic, which is just a set of chords that are all based around the root note of the scale. So in this it's C, just with different inversions or suspended chords. This might be useful in an introduction or a verse section of the song where you don't want the progression to progress harmonically too far. Okay, so there's a range of ways in which you can get chords into chords and build up chord progressions. I hope that helps. In the next video, we'll look at how we use these chords to build melodies and harmonies, because chords has 8 channels in which you can send MIDI and have those channels routed to your instruments using notes of the current chord. So we'll look at that in the next one. See you then.